From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Brian Coffey and Terry Griffin will be in to talk about their new economic analysis of how observing the Sabbath affects farm income. Their work shows that there is a cost of taking that time off, although that has to be weighed, they stress, against the faith and spiritual value of doing so. Also, K-State's Chris Little is back to talk about the conditions that lead to mold development in grain sorghum and what the latest research says about averting that problem through management. Further ahead on this week's K-State Horticulture segment, Gregg Eyestone on protecting young landscape trees and shrubs from winter feeding by rabbits and other pests. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. And now we'll take a closer look at a unique analysis that's just out from the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. And you might phrase it this way, it's rather seasonal in its nature, putting some numbers to what sorts of changes we see in farm income when farmers and ranchers take the Sabbath off for faith purposes. Now, joining us, Brian Coffey, Terry Griffin, agricultural economists at K-State. We're getting into a topic here that's, well, it's intriguing, Brian, and certainly would be sensitive to a lot of people. But what drove you and Terry to examine this?
Yeah, well, I think Brittany and Terry had a good basic idea here, looking at whole farm planning, how to maximize farm income and the effect of the days suitable for field work on that. And so then Terry had an interesting idea. You know, in rural America, it's very common that people would take a day off pretty much every week to go attend church. And we know that people do that for non-financial reasons. There's a lot of different reasons that people might do that, including family reasons or personal beliefs or their faith and those sorts of things. But from a practical standpoint, if you do decide to take off a day every week, that's a day that you can't be doing something else. And so for a farmer, that would mean that's a day you can't be in the field. And so during planting time or harvest time, giving up a day of potential field work, has a cost. And so we just thought, since it is very common that farm families would spend a day in church, it'd be interesting to know if they do that consistently, what's the financial impact to their operation.
Now, this is not to critique observing the Sabbath by any means. It's simply to get an idea of the economic result of that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And we would say as economists that when people do take a day off for the Sabbath, that they're seeing some benefit there. And so actually in this analysis, we're not saying should you observe the Sabbath, but rather if you do, then what's the financial impact? And I think for a lot of people, there's non-financial reasons to observe the Sabbath, and they would see those benefits as outweighing any cost of doing so.
There's a value to that, of course.
Absolutely.
Intrinsic, yeah. Well, Terry, how does one attach numbers to this question, though?
So Brian's correct. We didn't look at the benefits, only the cost side of that equation, but we do, mention some benefits, and some of these may be spiritual, which would be largely intangible, but there's also community aspects. There's networking, and people will congregate for non-church reasons too, and there's benefits. But as Brian said, we ignored quantifying the benefits and only focused on the cost side, and made the assumption that if someone is willing to forego X number of dollars, then the benefits to them should be at least that much. So we took a whole farm linear programming model. So on your radio show last year, one of my former MAB students came in, Brittany Rosberg, and talked about how we evaluated whether their farm could take on another tract of land, a few hundred acres, and still farm in a timely manner without changing the amount of equipment. Well, we took that study a step further and removed a half a day or a full day during peak times away from days suitable for field work to determine what would it cost a beginning farmer to attend church. And so this is a whole farm linear programming model that I've used to evaluate precision agriculture adoption for mechanical weed control and other studies. So it's well-documented model.
Were you looking at the question of an individual farmer taking time off to attend church services week by week by week, or simply peak times? How did you parse that out?
So there were 3 times of the year, planting for summer crops and harvest of summer crops were 2 separate time periods. And then everything else was non-peak, which there's not a lot of activity. If you take off 3 or 4 days a week, it doesn't really matter. But for planting and harvest is where the action was. So we evaluated that set of 7 weeks in the spring and then another 7 weeks in the fall for that.
And it revolves around simply the sacrifice of labor time.
It is. So there's no labor working. This farm was unpaid labor only, family labor. And so when we took the day off, nothing was happening. There's no tractors moving, no combine harvesters moving. It was essentially your classic downtime model. We talk about the $1,000 lunch. So the idea there is, if we shut down planting operation on April 20th for 2 hours so we can go into the town and have a barbecue, all the employees, the whole family, everybody, no tractors are planting, that's a $1,000 lunch real quickly, because if we do not plant on April 20 but make it up, let's say at the end of the year on June 1st, there's a yield penalty. Yields are lower. And so there's penalties for that. And that's really what we were looking at, was the yield penalties from delayed planting from the peak times, the best times, to tack it on at the end of the year.
So what are the penalties? What are the costs? What numbers did you pin down here?
Worst case scenario, if we took a complete day off for planting, harvest, and non-peak, we're looking at about $8,000 per year for a 1,600-acre farm. The 1,600-acre farm is sort of just recently grew. It was a 1,200-acre farm last year. They added a few tracts of land to make it 1,618 acres, but with the same equipment. So they're on the borderline of being under-equipped. But, we're looking at $8,000 for that farm. Previously, before the farm grew, it was $1,800 per year.
Now, you mentioned you were looking at half days as well as full days. So does that, what you just said, include that breakout?
Yes, it does. So if we took off a half a day for planting and half a day for harvest to attend church, so let's say the mornings and after lunch they get back and work another 5-8 hours, whatever half the day would be, then we're looking at about $2,200 per year for the larger farm and roughly $1,000 for the smaller farm.
Brian, when you come up with those numbers and you contemplate them, what do they say then about these economic sacrifices, if you will, for observing the Sabbath?
So I would say one thing to keep in mind is like Terry mentioned, this is assuming a complete shutdown. So there may be other ways that people would mitigate this with hired labor or some things like that. So I would see these as kind of upper bounds, But I would say that, realistically, this is part of taking a day off. There's going to be a cost to it, because if you are resting and spending time with your family, that's time you can't use to do something else. And I think, putting some numbers with that is helpful. Like we already talked about, it's not necessarily guidance of whether to take a day off or not, but it's just saying that there is a cost to these kind of choices.
Terry,
when I mentioned $8,000, a lot of people will say, well, that's something, but that's not a whole lot compared to a lot of farms are grossing over $1 million a year. But if we look at the last few years of Kansas Farm Management Association accrual net farm incomes, we're looking at 13-17% for the last 2 years. The incomes are down, so it is something that's substantial, and it does have some a weight that we need to be aware of.
One could liken this to any number of other non-farm activities as well, though, beyond church activities. Young parents following their kids around to athletic events and so forth. It's the same concept.
It's the same concept. One of our critics is in our peer review right now. They said, well, this would be analogous to going to the movies once a week or something. And true, except when a farmer goes to the movies, they can kind of decide what day to go. Maybe when it's raining, Sunday's always on Sunday. Whether it may not be a Sunday. I mean, we set this up as a Judeo-Christian tradition and not necessarily strict observance from Christian denominations. Yeah, it doesn't have to be church related, but any type of full downtime models.
So, Brian, in conclusion, as a producer would see this work and think about it, you'd like them to just at least be mindful of the economics involved here. Is that the point?
I think so. I think being mindful, and I think also as we think about observing the Sabbath week to week is something that's very commonly done. Mm-hmm. I think by their actions, people are saying, we value that time off and that time with our religious community and time with their families quite a bit because there is a cost to it. So I think just understanding that trade-off is important, and it's kind of interesting, something I think a lot of people haven't thought about either.
Yeah, I think we're the first ones to quantify this, although, being around farming communities, it seems to be a recurring question, about people face every week. And as far as I can tell, there wasn't any quantitative metrics ever put on this before.
Looking forward to this being published. It will soon be available on the agmanager.info website out of K-State. The analysis by title, The Cost of Being Faithful, What Do Farmers Give Up to Keep the Sabbath? That's in an economic sense. And the two of the authors with us today, we appreciate you coming over. Brian, Terry, thanks for your comments right here.
Thank you, Eric. It's good to be here.
Terry Griffin and Brian Coffey, agricultural economists at K-State, co-authored this work along with a graduate researcher at K-State, Brittany Rosberg. And you're listening to Agriculture Today with more after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today resumes now on the K-State Radio Network. In the guest chair once again with us is Chris Little. Chris is a research plant pathologist here at Kansas State, and he focuses on row crop diseases largely in his work. Chris, our grain sorghum production in Kansas has encountered, more often than we'd like anyway, mold in those grain sorghum heads, particularly around harvest time, which impacts harvestability and quality. And given the dampness at harvest time this year, it was likely an issue again, was it not?
Yeah, and sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes there's a lot of weathering out there. And, technically weathering is something that happens after the black layer forms in the grain, kind of as you were mentioning, closer to harvest, and you get a lot of moisture, high humidity, above 85% for more than a week at a time, and you're really in the zone for weathering. Grain mold per se is something that can happen very early in development, before the black layer formation, right at flowering. The fungi that cause weathering late or mold early, there are many of the same species. Lots of different species of fungi that can colonize the grain and cause some of those quality problems either late or early. But definitely, the more moisture you have at harvest, the longer you go before you can harvest, and the cooler it gets with that moisture, the more we can see some mold problems showing up.
And the symptoms are expressed in a variety of ways?
That's right. Often in Kansas, we see sort of darkening discoloration of the grain, maybe flecking of the grain, maybe pigment accumulation in the pericarp or the outer layer of the grain that just show that there's a little bit of damage going on there. Just a little bit of surface discoloration or burnishment, if that's a word. And again, sometimes you don't see external symptoms, but inside the grain, there'll be some colonization that's occurring by some of these. The internal tissues, which there are a number of different individual internal tissues. And so the more colonization that's going on inside the grain, you do get reduced weight of the seed, reduced grain quality, reduced endosperm, all those characteristics that you really want for optimum yield components and milling components that an end user might use, or feed components that an end user might be interested in.
And in fact, those quality issues are manifested at the end use as feed, as flour if one's into the food-grade sorghum area. There are even potential toxins resulting from these?
Unfortunately, and this is a praise that we have for sorghum, is that the aflatoxin problem in corn is not a problem in sorghum as far as we know. Some of those species can show up that do produce aflatoxins, but it's very rare. So certainly growers should be much more concerned about aflatoxin issues, especially when it's really hot and dry and stressful. But in the case of sorghum grain mold, most of our fungal species are not producing the hazardous toxins that might be associated with corn. So that's a positive there. Now, I think there's a lot more work that has to be done in really evaluating our sorghum grain, especially if it's to be used for feed, for example, as most of it is, for a whole range of mycotoxins that we don't have a lot of good information in Kansas on. Again, aflatoxin is not an issue, but there are other toxins like fumonisins, trichothecenes that are produced by fusarium species that need more evaluation. There's ochratoxin and patulin that are formed by Aspergillus species and Penicillium species, other molds that you would find on grain that we don't know a lot about either. So I think there's room for research in that area.
Job security.
That's right. That's right. But generally, clean grain is good grain. I think growers can go out, have a look, and if it looks clean, I think it's going to be okay, and generally very high quality in our state.
Chris, because these molds are so weather-driven by high moisture levels principally, in the management sense, what can be done practically to try to suppress, if not prevent them?
Again, fortunately, we produce most of our grain sorghum in this state under relatively dry conditions. So we don't have the same grain mold problem that you might see in Texas field or in a field in Puerto Rico or Haiti, for example, or something like this. And that's good. And so when we can modify the environment, or we can change, the timing of planting, or we can change the length of time that it takes for our sorghum variety to flower and mature, little tricks like that can be avoidance mechanisms. So if we're in a spot in southeast Kansas and every year we notice a little bit of discoloration on the grain or weathering, maybe you can plant a variety that matures a couple weeks earlier to prevent sort of intersecting with that period of time where you typically have higher humidity, and harvest it a little bit earlier so that you have higher quality grain, if that's an issue for someone, for example. But if you're out in western Kansas, it's going to be so dry, right. You probably won't have an issue out there.
Normal years.
Yeah, in normal years, that's right. Genetic resistance is also very important. And a lot of the commercial varieties out there that have really big heads, they're semi-loose panicles, okay? I mean, they're relatively dense. You get plenty of yield potential, but the denser that panicle is, the more probability that some of the interior kernels will have some damage versus the outside, just because it traps air, traps moisture between those panicle branches. So if there's just a little bit of spread in that panicle, that can make all the difference in the world. So that's sort of a form of structural resistance, if you will. That is, just the structure of the panicle itself. Again, most of our hybrids out there are just perfect because they're producing a lot of yield, and there's just a little bit of space between the kernels, and generally most years we're okay. So that really helps. But there's also resistance, like biochemical, physical resistance in the seed to many of these pathogens out there as well. But as we grow more and more of the white-seeded varieties, those can be more prone to mold compared to the red-seeded varieties. And it turns out that the red seed varieties generally have more chemicals in them that are antimicrobial. And they also have a lot of health benefits to humans, to livestock, to however they might be used. So that's good. All right. So avoidance on one hand and genetic resistance on the other hand are really our two keys that we're interested in when it comes to avoiding and managing grain mold in sorghum.
Well, tell about your research initiatives into the nature and the function of these molds, Chris, as they would turn up on grain sorghum.
Sure. So, one area that we've always pursued is looking at resistance in grain sorghum to mold fungi. So as I started off, there are many, many different species of fungi that can cause mold, and resistance to these different fungi are going to be different. So selecting and finding sources of resistance is very critical. And so we work very closely with the breeding program in Manhattan and the breeding program in Hayes to screen exotic sources of material for grain mold resistance. And some of the same pathogens that cause grain mold can also cause stalk rot too. So we're also working on that sort of simultaneously, trying to kill two birds with one stone a little bit there. So mainly the fusarium pathogens that cause so many diseases in the sorghum crop. So we really want to evaluate for grain mold resistance. We want to evaluate the seeds for seed quality. And one of the best ways to evaluate the seeds for seed quality that are infected is to measure their germination, measure the seed weight, things like that. It tells you about their germination potential, which is a direct reflection of endosperm quality, which is a direct reflection of nutrition and milling quality and all the end uses that might be important. Just by germinating the seed, it can tell us an awful lot. I think that's important because it relates to protein and fat and fiber and starch components in the seed that these fungi can actually sort of eat away at, reduce, And
that's where the value is.
Yeah, and that's where the value, for whatever application, that's where the value of the grain really is. And so it's important to remember that these fungi can whittle away at those value traits. And we certainly want to select for genetic materials that have really good resistance to grain mold that maintain those yield and value traits to a high degree.
And it is consistent enough of a problem in our grain sorghum production in Kansas. It merits this constant attention in research. And hats off to you and your team of researchers for pursuing just that. Chris, as always, we appreciate the summary, and we wish you well as you head into the holidays. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
He's Chris Little, research plant pathologist at K-State, and talking of the development of molds in grain sorghum, particularly as one approaches harvest time. You're tuned to Agriculture Today. We'll break away once again and return with today's agricultural news headlines and more here on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now. Eric Atkinson here, and next up for you, Today's agricultural news headlines, these courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the 2018 Farm Bill that had divided the House last summer over food aid issues ended up passing easily yesterday, as Congress has now sent the legislation on to President Trump for his signature. The bill passed 369 to 47 yesterday afternoon, 182 Republicans joining 187 Democrats in supporting the bill, which drew applause in the House chamber after passage. The House vote follows the 87 to 13 Senate vote for the bill on Tuesday, reflecting strong support in both chambers of Congress for the compromise legislation. Prior to the vote, House Agriculture Committee Chairman Michael Conaway of Texas told his colleagues during a floor speech that farmers and ranchers are going through a difficult time, with net farm income down 50% from 5 years ago. He noted the capital that farmers have eaten through and the economic pressures that farmers may face. This bill will provide needed certainty for farmers and ranchers, according to Colin Peterson, representative from Minnesota. He'll become chairman of the House Agriculture Committee in January. In particular, Peterson noted the dairy policy in the Farm Bill, which reflected a major overhaul following weaker provisions in the 2014 Farm Bill. Now, the Cooperative Dairy Farmers of America issued a statement after yesterday's vote, thanking Congress for the changes made to the dairy safety net. The bill includes higher protection levels for dairy producers under the Dairy Margin Coverage Program and also has provisions allowing milk donations to food banks and more incentives for milk purchases for people in the SNAP program. Following passage of the Farm Bill, Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue issued a statement calling the bill good news because it provides a strong safety net for farmers and ranchers, in his words, who need the dependability and certainty this legislation affords. Now, we mentioned the changes to the price support programs in the new bill yesterday. With trade being a major topic, the Farm Bill also includes an assurance that the Market Access Program has at least $200 million in annual funding to help grow foreign markets. And animal agricultural groups and the National Association of State Directors of Agriculture were pleased with the $300 million in funding over 10 years for animal health programs, including the creation of a vaccine bank that will largely focus on protecting the livestock industry from the risk of a foot and mouth disease outbreak. And the fledgling industrial hemp industry has been nonstop in its praise for full legalization and cultivation of hemp in the Farm Bill. Hemp Incorporated, that's a hemp processors, said the provisions could catapult the industry to top $20 billion by the year 2022. Market rumors have been circulating that China plans to buy U.S. soybeans following a pledge made by Chinese President Xi Jinping to President Trump during that Group of 20 meeting in Buenos Aires earlier this month. However, it remains unclear how much China will buy and when. Reuters reported yesterday afternoon that Chinese state-owned companies had bought at least 18.4 million bushels of soybeans. If confirmed through the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, that buy would mark the first major purchase of U.S. soybeans in several months by Chinese buyers. It's not clear who will buy, when they will start to buy, and how much they will buy, though the Commerce Ministry said that China will increase U.S. imports, especially of agricultural, industrial, and energy products. Those are the words of a professor of agricultural economics at the China Agricultural University, Yun Wang. So far, on the China side, officials did not say the country will immediately import a substantial amount of U.S. agricultural products, but the Commerce Ministry did say it would increase imports according to domestic demand. According to the China market rumors, the Chinese government had given permission to Sinograin, that's China's National Strategic Grain Reserve Company, to buy 3 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans. Also, permission to Coffey, that's China's largest state-owned import and export company, to buy another 2 million metric tons. Also, rumors that the two companies are negotiating with some U.S. sellers on soybean basis. That leads us right on into this week's Kansas soybean update. With that is Gregg Eyestone. Greg?
Steve Swaffer joins us. He's the executive director of No-Till on the Plains Incorporated. And Steve, we're not that far away from the 23rd annual No-Till on the Plains Winter Conference, January 29th and the 30th in Wichita.
We've got a great set of speakers this year, including some high-profile soil scientists and progressive producers. And we think we'll have a little something for everybody this year.
And this is one, as it always has been the case, something for who is just beginning no-till farming practices or who are advanced in no-till farming practices.
We have sessions on the 28th that are aimed just at somebody who's getting started. We also have a session on the 31st for folks that are more advanced, and this year we even have a special workshop for those looking at reducing their fertilizer budget.
You also have an early bird deadline if people want to register as well?
The end of this month, December 31st, is our last day to register for our regular pricing, and then on January 1, the prices will go up just slightly.
Having the pre-session is something new, the pre-conference workshop that you have on the 28th.
We have a special guest, Joel Williams, who's going to be talking with producers about how they might be leveraging their nutrients that are in the soil, how they might actually take advantage of some of the nutrients with some plant synergies that are going on, and maybe even some foliar applications. So that's an all-day workshop focused specifically on reducing your budget for your fertilizer.
Past the conference itself on January 31st will be the AIM Symposium, and I'm sure that's going to be filled with a lot of great information.
This year we're focused on, again, soil health. We're looking at some nutrient density within foods issues, but also just how one might make the most advantage or take the most advantage of a cubic acre. So making sure that you understand there's value in what's below the surface to your crop.
You also have a special winter conference networking banquet, too.
Right, on Wednesday night, for people staying over for the AIM Symposium, we'll have a special banquet where you can come interact with the other attendees. We're going to have a special presentation about how you can spend $100 on 1 acre and change the world.
And Steve, finally, if people want to register, the best way to do that is go to your website?
Right, www.notill.org. That will give you registration information for all of our events, including some package deals if you register for multiple events.
That is Steve Swaffer, Executive Director of No-Till on the Plains Incorporated, who has been our guest on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
This Agriculture Today continues now with our weekly segment on horticulture, and along our way now is Riley County Extension Horticultural Agent Gregg Eyestone. Greg, we take up the topic today of protecting those woody ornamentals in our landscapes from rodent feeding, also protecting certain landscape trees from the rays of the sun during the winter and sun scald. More on that one in a moment. But our younger trees and shrubs in particular are quite susceptible to rodent feeding at this time of the year, are they not?
Yes, there's less food options out there for different wildlife species, and so oftentimes our younger trees and shrubs become their only source. And so a protection of some kind, whether it be a repellent, I prefer using a barricade of some kind, will really protect those plants. And it's a situation where, like in my mind, that I didn't have rabbits for quite a while, and then one fall, winter I did, and those plants that weren't protected did become a food source, and actually some of those I did lose come the stress of the summertime. I was hoping they'd make it through, but once it got really hot and dry, there just wasn't enough resources for that plant to continue surviving.
And rabbits are the main perpetrators, aren't they, typically?
I think rabbits are probably one of the bigger ones. There are some voles and field mice that may be issues as well, and those may be even a little harder to manage than, say, a rabbit. Just because size, you're going to need a barricade of some kind that's small enough that those field mice or voles can't get to, whereas a rabbit, typically chicken wire or something maybe a little bit larger, will work around larger plantings. If you got a single stem, there's tree wraps. We were mentioning earlier maybe PVC pipes, something that creates that barrier between the food source and the eater in this case.
How young does plant material need to be for it to be highly susceptible to this feeding, this girdling, if you will, around the bark?
Yeah, I think anything's probably 1, 3 to 4, maybe 5 years old tissues, depends on the species of the plant, is probably susceptible. Even larger, older materials can become feeding sources, but probably won't, unless they do go all the way around the stem, won't kill the plant. But on the younger plants, a third of the plant chewed off, losing that water conducting and food resource tissues come summertime would be really stressed and can cause death.
A bit more on the damage itself. There are times, it seems, Gregg, where that feeding is fairly well up on the plant, which raises some questions about how, for instance, a rabbit was able to scale that height.
Yes, they can reach up there, and if we get some snow cover, they'll kind of be on top of the snow. And so how high up is a good question the barricade should go. And, whatever materials you have, I think the higher the better. It's just the kind of risk or gamble you want to take, how high up you need to take that barrier. I use some tree wraps, which come kind of a vinyl material, has a white color to it, and those are probably 18 to 24 inches. So that's kind of the range I'm looking at, but higher's not bad, that's for sure.
And that wrap can stay right there on the plant material throughout the winter season. It does need to be removed come springtime then, or not?
I think it's a good idea to take it off in the spring. Anything that if you're connecting it somehow with duct tape or some type of tape or string and wire, those definitely need to come off for the spring growth for sure. But some materials you may need to kind of secure in place somehow, wire or something like that may be required. Just depends on the materials you're using.
And if you're using, as you mentioned, say mesh wire as a barricade, rabbits are fairly adept at getting under that too, aren't they? They can be persistent.
Yeah, that's a good point. Going maybe below the area is necessary too. That's where I say where field mice and voles may be more challenging because they're going to be maybe at or below ground level feeding, and unless you're really scouting or paying attention to that, you may have damage that you don't notice. A lot of these younger plants may be mulched in a little bit to protect the roots for the winter time, and so that makes a kind of a barricade for them to hide the field mice and voles. So, yeah, putting it down, at least through that, maybe a little bit farther into the soil if you have the space around the crown of your plant would be ideal.
And you brought up the repellents. Those products tend to work fairly well, or does that vary by brand, if you will?
I would say there's a lot of variance out there. It's maybe trial and error, particularly with the species that you're trying to keep away. A lot of them are odors. Some maybe tastes, so they may have to actually cause a little damage tasting it. So lots of things to try out there. The situation with repellents is, they're not a one-time fix. You're probably going to go out and reapply those depending on the label and the environment. So you just have to read those product labels. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. That's where a barricade typically, as long as it doesn't blow away or something like that, it's going to probably give you a little more assurance through the fall and winter season.
Do want to touch upon here as well, Gregg, those trees which might be susceptible to what's called sun scald. What is that, and which trees would be more prone to it?
Yeah, typically lower portions of some of our thin-barked plants or young plants, those tissues may heat up in the wintertime when a nice sunny day, drops rapidly as the sun goes down, and those tissues may have started to kind of acclimate for springtime, but really wasn't prepared for that and may have some damage, maybe even death of the cells. Typically seen on the south and west side. Some people call it southwest blight, those kind of things. Protecting those tissues, you can leave stems or branches on longer. don't need to start limbing your plants up. So the natural structure of plants help protect that. Oftentimes you think about trees. They live in a forest and a community together. They kind of shade each other and help protect each other. So if you have a tree out there in the front lawn all by itself, you may need to do some protection on your own. We talked about some tree wraps again. Something in the old days we used to maybe whitewash the trunks of the trees. Again, that was kind of to reflect that sunlight away from the trunk so it stayed maybe colder or dormant during these times when we do have maybe nice sun, warm days, but it's going to get cold as the sun goes down, temperatures drop.
If one simply lets this process play out and run its course, much worry about the health of the tree?
Yeah, I think you can definitely see it a fairly common situation, and if you've invested some money in some trees, probably worth the effort to tree wrap it or do some kind of shading. Again, leaving branches on as long as possible really helps as well.
Gregg, as always, we appreciate your input. Many thanks to you.
It's my pleasure. Have a happy holiday.
And happy holiday to you and yours likewise. That's Gregg Eyestone, Riley County Extension horticultural agent, with those thoughts on landscape ornamental protection for the winter on this week's K-State Horticulture segment. That's our time for today. Thanks to you for being along with us. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.